Hey, happy Friday. Welcome back to another Friday Tech Workshop. I'm Joseph, a senior developer advocate with Appsmith, and this week it's all about sending email attachments. So first we're going to look at using an SMTP connector and sending a plain text email, and then we'll use the file picker widget to attach a file from the user's device. Next, we'll use the camera widget to capture a photo from the user's device and send that as an email attachment. Then we're going to switch over to the REST API and use Twilio SendGrid. We'll start out doing a plain text email again, and then we're going to switch over to generating files. So first, what we're going to do is take data from an API response, transform it, and turn it into a text file that we can attach. Then we'll do a similar approach using a PDF and the JS PDF library to dynamically generate a PDF from an API response and send that as an email attachment. So let's get started. First, we'll check out the SMTP connector, and then we'll move on to the REST API and look at the different file type attachments. All right, let's check it out. Okay, I'm starting out on a blank page of the app here. And first, we're just going to do a basic SMTP email server and just a plain text email. So we'll start out by creating a new data source, and you'll want to select the SMTP data source here. Let's see, here it is. Put in your host address and then the port number. And that port number, it's going to be specific to your server, whatever SMTP provider you're using. It is usually going to be 587 or 465. And then if you're using TLS, it could be this 25 or 2525. But chances are it's going to be one of those two. So you'll have your host address and the port number. And then in this case, I'm using SendGrid. And the way that theirs works is the username is the word API key. All lowercase, one word. So the word API key goes here, and the actual API key is the password. So depending on which SMTP server you're using, that can be a little different, but just check the docs for the one that you're using. You should just need those 4 pieces of info there, and then you can test it. So I already have my data source set up. I'm going to cancel on this one. But again, if you are using Twilio SendGrid, then you'll want to use API key for the username. Your host address would be the smtp.sendgrid.net, and then the port number. And I'm using 587 for mine. So once you have that set up, then you can create the first email API under that data source. So you've got that data source created. And then when you go to create a new query, you'll want to select that data source and create it inside so it gets those credentials, that login. So I'm adding a new query here. We'll call it send email. And then for the command, it's send email. In this case, there's just the one option, but most of the other data sources and APIs, they have lots of different methods here. So what I'm going to do is just send one to myself and copy that for the recipient. Okay, subject, we'll do test and test from Appsmith. So that's the bare minimum that you need, a body, subject, and then who it's from and who it's to. And if you've got your data source set up correctly, then this should work. So let's go ahead and test this out. And you see I've got a response back here showing we've got a message, the message was successful. Okay, and then we'll check out the email tab here. You can see that this email just came through, and you might have it flagged as spam, especially if you put in a really short description and body like this. So just be careful with like how many tests that you run with really incomplete emails like this, because you'll start to hurt your reputation. Your email reputation, they keep track of if you're sending a lot of spam, and that's going to make it harder for you to get your email delivered. So it's working, but if you see it flagged as spam, just be careful with the content. Put in more in the email body and the subject so that you don't just have tons of test ones that bring down that email ranking. or reputation. Okay, so next what we're going to do is a file attachment. So if we go back to the API body here, and you can see there's a field for the body text, and then there's a separate field for attachments. And you can see with the placeholder text here, you just give it an array of files from the file picker. Really easy. So I'm just going to drag in a file picker. And we'll load this up. I'm going to select an image here. All right. So I'm attaching this image. And now that it's loaded in the file picker, once the image is in there, then you can reference it and send it. So you'll want to put that test file in there before this next step, or else it's going to say undefined, that there's nothing in there. So now we're going to the attachment field, and we'll just reference that file picker1.files array. And it's only a single file in the array, but you still want to send it as an array. And then if you need more, you can actually change the file picker to allow multiple file uploads, or you could merge data from different sources and put them all into an array for multiple attachments from different data sources. But here we're just going to attach this one. You can see that inside of the file picker, it has the actual data URL. So it shows data : the file type, and then a base64. And then after that's the actual base64 string. And then you've got the name property. So you could make that dynamic if you want and change the name, but I'm just taking what's in the file picker. So we'll go ahead and send this. And you can see we got another. So we come back here and I should see a new email on this thread. Or maybe it's in the spam. Here it is. Okay, so just like I was saying before, based on what's on the subject and the body, it might get flagged as spam, and you don't want to do that too many times. It'll really hurt your sender reputation and make it hard to get your emails delivered. So I think I'll adjust that. I'm going to say this one looks safe, and then we'll maybe adjust that subject to avoid that one next time. So uploading a file that already exists, a file from the end user, that's really easy. Next, what we're going to do is upload one from the camera widget, and capturing that file is easy, but it's actually a little tricky to upload it because it's not a full file yet. It's only a data URL. So let's go ahead and capture an image so you can see what I'm talking about here. And just like with the file picker, we want to load this up with some data before we try to reference it in the query. So I'm going to go ahead and take a picture. We will save that. And then back to the query so that we can reference it. Oh, it looks like switching tabs there lost it. So we'll take one more. Okay, so now we have an image in the camera widget and we're looking at this attachment field. And this time to attach the image, I'm going to use the tutorial here. I've got something typed up and we're just going to copy this section, which will give us the entire file instead of just the raw data. So now we're inserting the data blob here and also the file type, the data format, and a name. And then that will create an entire file object that gets uploaded and attached with the email. Now, I'm just going to make this a little longer so it hopefully doesn't hit the spam filter. Okay, so we'll run this. And it's probably going to take a little bit longer. That was still pretty quick, but it should have attached something. So, okay, so it came through again. It's also catching it as spam. So extending the subject there wasn't enough. It still thinks this is spam, but it's at least going through. So just, be careful. Don't do too many tests and get your account locked for excessive spam. So we got a file uploaded from the user's device and then a camera image. So next we're going to switch over to the SendGrid API and we'll go back to doing a plain text email, and then we'll look at a couple methods of generating a file and attaching those. So the next thing we want to do here is we're going to create a new data source for the SendGrid API. So go to the new data source button here and then choose authenticated API. We want to save the credentials on the Appsmith server so that they're not in the API itself. So then we'll call this SendGrid API. You'll want to put in the URL here for the SendGrid API. All right, and then I've got all the values for this in the tutorial over here. So what you want to do is you create that new authenticated API data source, name it. You use the api.sendgrid.com URL for the root URL, and then you'll have different things after that depending on what you're trying to do. So the root URL is in the data source, and then the individual APIs will have the rest of the URL. And then you want to choose authentication type, bearer token, and then paste in your API key. So that is not the header here, because this is not secure. If you look at these fields, they're just plain inputs. But then down here, if you choose bearer token, this field is encrypted, and you see the green lock icon. So you'll want to use this instead of using the header authentication and then putting the key here. So I already have my data source saved and set up. I just wanted to show where to do this and where it's at in the docs there. And then to create your key, just go to app.sendgrid.com to the settings/API keys. You can find it on the sidebar here and create a new API key. Then either choose full access or restricted, and make sure you enable that mail send permission for, I believe, full access if you want to be able to actually send one. So again, I've already got mine created. I'm going to cancel out on that and the data source. So once you have your data source created, then you can add an API underneath it that will use those credentials. So back to our query pane here, I'm going to add a new API under the SendGrid API data source. And so you can see it gets that beginning URL, and then we just need the second half of it for the individual API. And so in this case, it's going to be v3mail.send or /send. And then for the body, we'll go to the body type. We need to set this to JSON. And then in the body, let's just grab that from the tutorial here. So this format is a little different than our SMTP connector that we used earlier. You're going to have an object that has this personalizations array, and that's going to say who it's to in the subject. There's a few other optional things in here. I think reply to is one of them, if you want that to be different than who it's from. And then you've got the content. Now, in this first case, our content is just going to be plain text and the from address here. So let me change this to my address, because in the tutorial example, I just have this dummy placeholder here, and I want to actually receive this email and be able to test it here. So we're going to send this plain text email to myself here, and then if that works out, then we'll go on to some file generation. So I'm going to call this one send email API. And oh, this should be a post request, not a GET. So I think we have everything now. The authentication is going to come from the data source and add in the API key. So that's being inherited. And then we've got the body type JSON and our message here. So let's see what happens. Okay, we got a 202 accepted. So the API, it saw our authentication and the format of the body and the URL and all that's good. If that happens and you still don't get an email, double check that your sender address is verified, that you're allowed to send from that email address in Twilio in SendGrid. So other providers, other servers might let you just do that without verifying it, but this is just an extra security thing that they have. So you might get a 200 or 202 response that looks like it worked, but then you don't get an email. So that's probably what's going on. Okay, so let's see what we got. And here's the new one 1 minute ago. And we're back to just a plain text one, but this time it is coming from the API instead of using the SMTP server. So now that we have the API part working, now we're going to get into some more advanced stuff, generating a file on the client side and constructing it dynamically from an API response and then attaching it. So Next thing that we're going to do is pull in some fake data to generate that text. And what I'm going to do is create a new API. Let's see, we'll go to the Queries tab here, adding a new REST API. And this time I'm just going to grab some mock data from Makun. So they have this API playground that creates a bunch of fake data, and you can just use it like a regular API and even update and delete records, but it just resets. It's a temporary like JSON that you can edit, and you can try to update a record. It'll give you a good response like it actually edited, but then later that data just gets reset. So it's good for testing out. Let's see, we'll call this one, and we'll call this one get users. All right, so we've got an API that's getting back some data. I want to take this user and generate a text file using data from this API response, and then we'll attach that. So to do this, now we're going to need a JS object to process the data and get it in the right format into a text file before we can attach it. So you'll want to create a new JS object and then head over to the tutorial and just copy this section of code here. This will convert our API into a text file. And I think I named this a little different. Get customers. Let's just change that here. And let's just refresh so we can see that. I think that should take care of it. And then we can convert that response. Lowercase. All right. So now if we run this, what this is doing is awaiting the get customers API. So this is an async function. It will run and wait for that response. And then I'm grabbing the first record here. So I'm just setting it to the variable C, so I don't have to repeat the word customer here a bunch, and creating a string of text. It's not a file yet. So here I'm just creating a string of text with these new line characters, the /n for a line return. And once I have the text itself, the content of the file, then you create a new blob, and that should get an array of some type of data. So it's this text inside an array, and then the file type. And so that blob now will give us a URL that we can resolve into an actual file. So we have to use a file reader and convert that into base64 data. So what this will do is return a file object. You can see here it's returning an object where the content is this base64 string, which is converted right here from the blob. So couple steps, you have to make that blob first and then use a file reader to actually create the file. And then for the name, I'm dynamically naming it from that user. So we are creating dynamic file content as well as a dynamic name, both based on that API response. And now that we have this, it is returning a file object here. We can go back to the query where we just use the API to send an image. And instead of that image right here, let's see. So back to the API, what we want to do is add one more property after from here for attachments. And then this should be an array of file objects. So I'm just going to put an array and then reference that one file that we just created inside JS object 1, creating that text file. And let's see, if you look at this, it's empty because that's a function call here. So I want to use .data, which will give us the data from the last time it ran. And now you can see in the attachments array here, there's that file object. So let's see what happens. We'll go ahead and run this. And we got a 200 again, 202 response. And let's see if it's in spam or regular mail this time. And we have a text file attached. It's got the right name. And there's the content. So it took data from that individual API response, constructed the content for the text file, and then created an actual file using the file reader, attached it, and sent it. So that's pretty cool. Next, what we're going to do is Basically the same thing, but with a PDF. So we'll go back to the API here, and instead of attaching this create text file, I need a new JS object to do basically the same thing, but for a PDF. So create a new JS object. And this time we've got some different code here for generating a PDF. You're gonna need to install the JS PDF library, which you can do from the editor here. I've already got it installed, but just to show you where it's at. So you'll click the library icon, the cube on the left sidebar, and then the plus here to add a new library, and then scroll down and find JS PDF. And then just click that button to install it. You can see I've already have it installed. So once that is installed, you'll be able to reference it. It is available as JS PDF. So back to our JS object 2 now. Here we can paste in this code, which is going to use JS PDF. So you need to install it first. And then this will take that get customers query. Again, it's going to run it just to make sure there's some data there, get the first record. It's constructing the exact same text body, but this time we're going to put that text into a PDF instead of a text file. So you create a new PDF using the new keyword. JS PDF is the library that you're referencing, so it's an object. And then inside of the object is this function called JS PDF. That just creates a blank file. There's nothing in it yet, but you can begin to manipulate it now. So then I'm just setting the text, using this text, and setting it at 10x and 10y, like the coordinate or the pixel position. So I think you can change those units to be like inches or millimeters or whatever, but it's pixels at first, or points. So then, similar to the other case, once the file or the content rather is created, you have to get that base64 data URL version of it, and then return a file that contains that data plus the file name and a type. And in this case, with Twilio's API or SendGrid, you need this disposition. So do you want it to be an actual attachment or in the body? And so just put it as the attachment if you want it to, to be separate, not merged into the body. So I think this is everything. We're ready to test out this PDF attachment. This should return a file object with all that base64 string there. And then we can update the API. So right here, instead of JS object 1, we'll get JS object 2, create PDF file. And again, I want to use that .data so that it's got something in there from the last time it ran. You could also tie this together with the API and then call the function and then run the second API. So run the first one to get some data, run the JS object to transform it into a PDF or a text file, and then run this one. I'm keeping this simple and not trying to tie all that together to a finished solution. More so just want to show the individual steps and how these things connect. So let's see, we got JS object 2. We're referencing that file here. So let's see if we get a PDF attachment this time. Okay, and let's check out the thread here and see if we got a new one. Okay, we got a PDF. There's the name and there's the content. So we dynamically created a PDF and a text file, inserted both of them, the names dynamically generated from the API response. So lots of different ways to create and upload files, capture them from a file picker or from the camera. We were able to generate a PDF and a text file using the API to send it or an SMTP connector. So ton of different options. There's not any one right way. It's just whatever works best for your use case. So I think that's everything for this week. If you have any questions on this one or comments, feel free to drop it below. So thanks again for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you next week.